Hello, everyone who's logging in. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining today. Looks like folks are trickling in, so I'm just going to go ahead and get us started. So thanks everyone for joining the 12th Annual SEEK Forum's 5th webinar, Planning for Equitable Existing Building Electrification, featuring Rincon Consultants, the Ecology Center, the Rocky Mountain Institute, and the City of Berkeley. Next slide. So this year's forum is funded and sponsored by 3C Ren, Bay Ren, and SoCal Ren, along with additional sponsorships from Terra Verde Energy, the Energy Coalition, and TRC. Thanks so much to our sponsors for helping us support planning efforts for this year's forum. Further, I'd also like to give a huge thank you to our promotional partners for helping us with outreach and extending to their networks so that more local governments can learn and hear from one another. Next slide. Perfect. And just to go over some quick housekeeping, we do have a Q&A box here for you all to ask questions through. So please do ask your questions through the Q&A box, and you'll also have an option to vote up on questions you would like to see answered. And that'll really help us decide which questions to ask. So please do use that feature. And then additionally, we do have a chat box here so you can interact with other participants. So feel free to introduce yourself, or you can reach out to SEEK staff, which would be myself, Serena Soar, or John Vandervoort, if you have any technical issues. Perfect. I'd like to pass it on to our moderator for this webinar, Rima Chakra, who is a senior planner for Rincon Consultants. Thanks for joining us, Rima.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. We're excited for this discussion today. We've lined up an excellent set of panelists to talk about existing building electrification. First, we've got Danae Shorter, who's a Community Engagement Program Director with the Ecology Center. Ecology Center is a nonprofit based in Berkeley that focuses on improving the health and reducing the environmental impacts of urban residents. Danae oversees programming for the Ecology Center store and Public Resource Center, their engagement and education programs, and Eco House. Danae brings extensive experience in community education and engagement, and she led the engagement for the City of Berkeley's existing building electrification strategy, which is the focus of our webinar today. Danae also led the development of the equity guardrails approach, which you'll hear more about in our upcoming presentation. We also have Michael Gartman, who's a manager with the Rocky Mountain Institute, specializing in carbon-free buildings. Rocky Mountain Institute is a global nonprofit working to accelerate the clean energy transition. Michael uses his background in cost estimating and project management based on his experience in the construction industry. His past work has included serving over 50 cities through technical assistance on residential policies, cost estimating over 1,000 commercial energy retrofits and solar installations, and building bridges. Michael led the building stock analysis and the cost and saving modeling analysis for the existing building electrification strategy for the City of Berkeley. We also have Katie Van Dyke, who is the Climate Action Program Manager and Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Berkeley. Katie manages projects and programs to advance Berkeley's climate goals and resilience strategies. Her work focuses on multi-benefit solutions to prepare the community to withstand and thrive amidst the many intersecting environmental, social, and economic challenges it faces. Some of her work has included supporting development of the city's first resilience strategy as part of the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative, coordinating implementation of the city's climate action plan, and co-managing a $1.5 million grant for a microgrid feasibility study. Katie led Berkeley's existing building electrification strategy. We also have Ryan Gardner. He's the Climate Action Program Manager with Rincon Consultants. Rincon is a consulting firm with offices throughout California, providing planning, engineering, and environmental and sustainability services. Ryan works on climate action plan development, greenhouse gas reporting and auditing, life cycle analysis, green building strategies, carbon accounting, carbon sequestration, and sustainable infrastructure. He's working with cities throughout the state on electrification ordinances, cost effectiveness studies. Ryan managed the consultant team on the Berkeley electrification strategy, and he led the development of the recommended actions. So for today's webinar, we have a presentation, which I'll hand off to Ryan here in a moment. for about 20 to 30 minutes, but then we've set aside the remaining time for a discussion among our panelists and to answer questions from all of you. So we really encourage you to just add questions as you hear from us in the presentation, so we can start to ask those after the presentation. So now we can go to Ryan.
Thanks, Rima. Yeah, so I'm gonna just give a little rundown of the project and the scope of work, and Danae is gonna hop in and give an overview of the outreach that we did and some of the results and kind of surprising results to that feedback as well before we get into questions. So just generally the scope of the project was to try to figure out what it will take and how fast the City of Berkeley will be able to electrify all of its existing buildings. And this was building off of the fossil fuel free goal that the city has established, and then also the new building electrification ordinance that was put in place last year and really began to significantly limit the amount of new natural gas infrastructure being added to the city, but we still have this big chunk of existing buildings that are predominantly using natural gas for things like HVAC and hot water heating and cooking. So from the very beginning of this project, the city made it really clear that while building electrification was, the physical end goal, that had to be done in an equitable manner, and we couldn't just, move forward as fast as possible without taking into account the equity impacts around doing that. So throughout the project, that was really the first step that we took, and working with the Ecology Center to kind of start doing that outreach and hear from the community in the beginning on how we could tailor this project. We ended up focusing primarily on low-rise residential buildings and single-family and multifamily, mostly because that makes up a vast majority of the building stock in Berkeley, and also because the data that's available as far as costing and just how consistent those buildings are compared to commercial and high-rise just made it more feasible to hit that with this project. And then as we went through it, really the goal was to come up with a suite of policies that would allow us to begin implementing more existing building electrification and determining what the phasing of that implementation looks like. So we started off with a building stock analysis. We moved into a cost and savings modeling phase where we did a energy model for every building within the city based on square footage, permit data, some other data sets. And then throughout did the community engagement with a real focus on disadvantaged and marginalized communities, and built our measures and strategies off of those. So the first real step was the building stock analysis. The City of Berkeley already had gone through and gotten square footages and addresses on a lot of information on Berkeley's existing building stock. And the building stock in Berkeley represented a few kind of significant challenges to electrification and retrofits in general. This graph shows the years in which Berkeley's existing buildings were constructed. You'll see a vast majority of them are before 1963 and a majority still before 1920s. So we have a really old building stock, which means generally poor envelope insulation and air sealing, older HVAC ducts that are leaky, old electric infrastructure like knob and tube wiring and really low capacity electric panels, and then asbestos and other things that kind of just make doing this work more difficult. And because of this older building stock, really no one size fits all approach. All of these buildings have different technologies that have been partially phased out over time or retrofits done over time that make it really a building by building approach. So that was a little tricky to model. And then Berkeley also has a really mild climate. So we found once we started doing the energy modeling that there just isn't a lot of energy use for heating and cooling for us to get savings off of. We'll talk a little bit more about that next. So once we had our building stock analysis and we were able to start doing some energy modeling, we started looking into our cost analysis. So to figure out first, how much electrification costs up front. We made 3 packages, and we initially looked at whole building electrification. So looking at electrifying all of the natural gas end uses that we find in buildings, which includes HVAC, hot water heating, stoves, and clothes dryers. And our first package, we looked at all economy products. So resistance heating and resistance stoves. And then we had a second package, which was mid-tier products. We brought in heat pumps, which are much more efficient, a little more costly on the front end. And then a third package that had these mid-tier products and additional envelope work, so air sealing, energy efficiency measures. And then for each one of these packages, we also modeled each of 3 different solar options. So a no solar package, an offset new load, where we essentially put a small solar array on that offsets the new electricity demand that was due to the electrification process. And then a third package, which was a net zero option, where we offset all of the expected electricity load for the building, essentially providing a net zero building. So once we ran the model, we came up with this kind of summary table of costs and results. The first thing to really kind of take away here is that all of the packages we looked at had on-bill energy savings, except for the economy appliances by themselves. So that was the only one where we saw an actual increase in costs, mostly due to high electricity costs and relatively low efficiency of those resistance heating options. Solar also, you'll notice, is probably one of the biggest indicators of cost effectiveness. So more solar is giving us better savings, but we're also aware that changes to net energy metering could really make some of these high solar arrays not feasible in the future. So when we developed our actions and measures, we really tried to focus on the offset solar. So those packages, the 0.2 packages, which is going to make it a little less reliant on net energy metering, since we're only offsetting a portion of the building's electricity consumption. Another takeaway here, the gross costs are pretty high. When we look at how much it costs to add electric panels, wiring, kind of update these old electricity infrastructure to allow for electrification, plus the cost of new appliances, in our kind of primary package that we looked at, which was 2.2, we're almost $30,000 in upfront costs to fully electrify a home. But if you look at the marginal costs, we essentially are able to cut that in half. So I think one of the big takeaways early on was, while doing a building full electrifying a full building all at once gives us some efficiencies, helps us limit the amount of natural gas infrastructure we need. There are some significant costs of doing that, as opposed to replacing appliances at time of replacement or time of burnout. The next column over, we then look at the costs with our incremental costs plus incentives or current incentives, which gets us down a little bit further. And then the final column, once we roll in incentives and possible financing, we're able to start getting down to some fairly competitive rates or costs in order to fully electrify a building. So some of the other key takeaways from this modeling, because of Berkeley's mild climate, fairly low energy consumption, and very few air conditioners currently, although that is changing, makes the value proposition a little bit more difficult. There's also high labor costs and high electricity rates. And then, like I said, older homes that require other upgrades like electric panels or getting rid of that knob and tube wiring if that hasn't been done already. What we see with the modeling trends is economy products without solar increased bill costs. So that's kind of a difficult one to work with, especially since there's no savings to do financing with. Solar dramatically improves the economics of electrification, but again, challenges with net energy metering moving into the future. And in Berkeley, a kind of surprising result was the envelope improvements really didn't help the payback. But what we heard from the community kind of over again is that there are other reasons to do this energy efficiency upgrades and air sealing, especially for resilience on high smoke days, improving the ceiling of the building, but also just for comfort moving forward. So those are kind of the big considerations to think through. And then we also saw longer paybacks in the multifamily sector. So it's a little bit more straightforward in single family. And then Michael will probably get into this a little bit later in some of our questions and answers, but we also found some really interesting equity considerations in paybacks. And since we did this as a geospatial analysis, we were able to see like areas of the city that had better paybacks than others. And those tend to correlate with things like home size, home type, neighborhood equity, and race, which was kind of a surprising finding. So yeah, after we kind of went through all the energy modeling and got a sense of what it's going to take to do this electrification work, we really started to ramp up our community engagement and start having kind of targeted discussions with the community. So I'm going to pull it over to Danae to kind of walk through that process and some of our results there.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate that. Again, my name is Danae Shorter with the Ecology Center, Community Engagement Program Director. Grateful to be here and talk at least briefly about the community engagement approach within this strategy. As Ryan said, this is a snippet of the huge and intentional community engagement and outreach approach in this strategy. So of course, it's super valuable to read the full strategy as a part of this. But from the Ecology Center, I think it was very important. I know that it was very important from the city and from the project team to lead with equity and to really make sure that the equity expertise was embedded in from the very beginning. The Ecology Center, we're a 51-year-old Berkeley nonprofit, really deep rooted in improving the health and environmental impacts in the community, specifically around our programming, zero waste, climate action, food and farming, sustainable living, youth development, amongst a variety of other things. But more importantly, again, an established community resource that has ties, whether personal or through our programs, of being very involved in environmental and health initiatives locally, which just helped to thread right into this community engagement approach. We were specifically identifying and leading this outreach and engagement for this project, holding both equity and the city community building relationship as core priorities. Of course, centering equity and building community trust and relationships, we'll get into the importance of that. And that's what we really had to keep and made sure we kept at the forefront of all this entire approach. The goal through this engagement was to really engage these key impacted communities, frontline communities, marginalized, disadvantaged communities, BIPOC communities, low income. The list is endless, but very specifically being intentional about not just reaching out and engaging with who the city or who governments traditionally reach out to. While that information and that feedback is valuable, to truly do this equitably, we need to make sure we are targeting and going out to the communities that are traditionally excluded from these conversations. Again, there's no one size fits all approach to community engagement and outreach, especially when we're talking about doing it equitably and focusing on these frontline and marginalized communities. So we utilized a variety of different approaches based on existing and learned information through this process. It's important to note that this also occurred during COVID-19, during the social uprisings. And so it really did shift a lot of the strategies, which was another lesson learned and just added to the skills that I think we all find especially valuable in working out in the community. So we used a variety, again, of different approaches. Some of those approaches included one-on-one conversations with established and trusted either civic or community thought leaders from community groups. Some of those were in-person conversations. Sometimes we convened in groups if that felt more appropriate for specific groups, utilizing personal connections through the Ecology Center or personal relationships through some of the other folks, my predecessor, Mina, to Louis, who I am grateful for a lot of the work before I was onboarded in this and just really utilizing all those connections and understand that it looked different while we use a collective term of marginalized groups or marginalized communities. Even within those marginalized groups, engagement has to look different, and it did look very different. And we shifted strategies and approaches depending on that. That initial engagement was really to gather the information on how to engage with the larger community group at times, whether it was going straight into a community forum. We used train the trainer model in some instances where that was a better fit for that specific community group, passing along information and then letting that community do peer-to-peer education and knowledge sharing, and then introducing the city in when it felt appropriate, when that community felt safe enough for the city staff to be threaded and embedded into that conversation. And then just taking it one step at a time and making sure it was the right time and place for all of that. Regardless of the different approach and strategy, we really just focused on using an equity analysis that leads with race, as it is the most predictive factor in life outcomes, which we'll get into in this next graphic you see here. There's a history of redlining, especially when we talk about here in Berkeley. We use this kind of, we got that feedback as well of the community, wanting to use this kind of targeted universalism approach. The goal, of course, was electrifying Berkeley's existing buildings, but understanding specific populations needed access and different resources for each of those groups. So identifying who those communities are, what those resources are needed, and then understanding something like this, the history that we also need to consider in developing strategies, engagement, and outreach around this. So as you can see in this graphic, racial inequities have been created and perpetuated, unfortunately, by the government, both locally and beyond. And that's something that we could not ignore when we're trying to reach out on behalf of the city and for a city led strategy like this. For example, due to the persistent legacy of discriminatory housing policies, where low-income families, specifically Black families in Berkeley, were denied financial opportunity to purchase homes and were not able to live in certain parts of the city, and just understanding that historical racist discrimination practices. And then on top of this, wanting to come out into the community and let folks know, get them engaged and really get them on board with something like electrifying Berkeley's existing buildings. It took a lot more work, and it took very intentional education, awareness, allocation of resources, in some instances a little bit more time. We just had to be patient and also be attentive to what the needs of those specific communities are based on this historical knowledge that we do know. And then unfortunately, we're still seeing today, these same communities of color are suffering at the highest rates of displacement, impacted by continuing ongoing housing crisis, displacement, gentrification, where those same areas were historically redlined. And this is all within this current context that folks are still dealing with. And that, again, is compounded by these specific areas also experiencing adverse health impacts. Hospitalization from asthma rates is high in the Black community here in Berkeley. So understanding and bringing up the benefits of electrification specifically in those conversations and making sure that was elevated versus some other approach that we might have used in a different community group. And for the context of the entire strategy, really making sure that if this is to be done equitably, this all needs to be put at the forefront, because this is the current context of where we're at, both locationally and historically, and needs to definitely be considered in all that we're working for. So we got a ton of feedback from different community groups. We kind of tried to compile it into different themes. There were some things we had heard before and had already been thinking about how to incorporate into the strategy. There were new things that we heard from new communities. Key feedback, as you can see here: health, safety, comfort, and resilience benefits of electrification should be accessible to all. We heard that from a lot of different communities, and that looked different as well. Of course, tons of concern around cost, which was a big deal to try to address in the strategy. concern of reliability of electricity supply, especially in some differently abled communities. We heard very specific feedback around that. Upfront and long-term costs are primary concern. Lots of different really important and valuable feedback. And in order for this outreach, we were deeming, as long as this outreach, it would not be successful or considered equitably if we didn't both affect decision-making and process and the policies, again, that were going to be developed from this feedback. I was just talking to Katie, and some of the first reactions we got were, yes, we'll provide feedback, but what are you going to do with it? Are you going to actually utilize it? Is it going to be incorporated into the strategy? Are you just checking a box? So we had to deal with that too, which was real, and it was coming from lived experience. And so we had to address that, not just in our approach and our ongoing development of this engagement strategy, but also ensuring that that feedback was actually considered, intentionally, reviewed, discussed, and incorporated as much as possible, which you'll see as we get into the next pieces here. As a result, very directly from this feedback, that equity guardrails were created as this foundation or a set of minimal requirements that the recommended proposals must meet in order to advance. So right off the bat, we knew that regardless of the climate and how quickly we wanted to electrify all the buildings, in order to do it equitably, there has to be this minimum set of what we're calling guardrails that must be met in order for us to advance. And even then still, each one of these needs to be, again, it needs to be passed through. So as you can see here, the 4 equity guardrails we came up with: access to health and safety benefits, so ensuring equitable access to improved health, safety, and comfort benefits from electrification, like cleaner air, cooling for hot days due to the upfront cost of electrification. Many households will need financial support, as you heard, that continued to be feedback that was brought up. So making sure that it's not just not a burden, but also that folks, marginalized communities specifically, are getting that equitable access to the benefits as well. Access to the economic benefits, or ensuring all community members, especially communities of color and historically disadvantaged groups, have equitable access to funding and financing mechanisms and to high road job opportunities. That was a lot of the feedback we got in communities wanting to be more involved, not just as renters or tenants, but also within the transition into electrification and what that could look like for their own communities. Maximize ease of installation, ensuring that incentives and programs for the community provide meaningful support to renters, owners, vulnerable community members, to really minimize as much as possible the procedural burdens associated with installation of electric equipment. We were having really direct conversations with people where we might have considered something to be easy, and they laid out 10 other reasons why that was not necessarily easy for their lifestyle that they were living, who may have been impacted differently. So hearing about that and making sure that was threaded into the guardrails so that any proposed policy would consider that. And then promoting housing affordability and anti-displacement, as you'll see later on in the presentation, around what we just spoke on, the ongoing housing crisis, cost, housing affordability, still very prevalent and will be an issue, continuing to be an issue. So ensuring that upgrades don't displace renters or overburden homeowners. We were engaging with homeowners and tenants. And then so we saw the concern based on, especially when we talk about marginalized communities, unfortunately, a lot of them being renters, and making sure they were protected as well and into the future. Making sure programs could support housing production, preservation, tenant protections, all of those things, and ensuring funds don't get diverted from developing new housing. So a lot more kind of went into the development of those guardrails, but again, most importantly, keeping those guardrails in mind as a foundation and a set of principles. I love the graphic that we came up with that really displays and demonstrates what we mean by this all needing to pass through the equity guardrails. In the next few slides, kind of going back to the community engagement, different approaches. One specific outreach and convening we did with Green the Church and Berkeley's Black Ecumenical Ministerial Alliance electrification meeting. It was specifically focused on engaging and reaching out to Berkeley's Black communities, specifically faith-based communities, and utilizing that relationship and that really strong and tight-knit community to thread in this project and get some feedback there. As you can see from this poll question we did at the convening, we asked attendees for input on what their priorities were generally. And you can see here, it's very diverse in what people felt like their priority were, from healthier and safer homes to housing affordability, energy costs, job creation, climate change was in there, racial justice, accessibility. And of course, we heard a lot of other things in discussions. And then if we compare that to the same poll question that was asked in a more general, more traditional outreach approach, you can see that the results of that poll are in green. The church you can see is in the green and the public meeting in the blue. It's almost completely opposite, with more than 70% of in that public meeting communicating their long-term priority strictly being around climate change impacts. And so you see less of that diversity in the range of what people's priorities are. We are tending to get some of the same feedback that we've heard. Again, very valuable as well, and definitely has to be incorporated into this. But if we're talking about doing this equitably and targeted outreach to communities traditionally excluded, we have to keep in mind that if we're not doing this equitably, we're not getting the results and the feedback from who's actually representative of the community. This next slide here is another example of that more traditional feedback. We put out a community survey. The city put out a community survey. And we look at the demographics of who actually responded to this survey compared to the actual demographics of the city. And you can see very clearly here that the feedback mainly came from those who were white, 65 plus, and homeowners, as opposed to what the actual makeup of the community is and what we heard from some of those other convenings, where we more intentionally targeted those marginalized groups and people. There's a whole lot more to this. There's a whole lot more that we did that I wish I had time to speak to, but I think it's important that even you just get a snippet of this, because this was hugely important and really big of the city to not just make sure that this was done equitably, but make sure it was done early and ongoing. And as we continue to think about it, before they even thought of doing a strategy or developing a strategy around this, doing the outreach, continuing to get the feedback during the development of the strategy, and then incorporating the development and of a engagement and outreach approach in the implementation of this and ongoing, to really co-create solutions to address the climate crisis together, and specifically to create and develop this strategy with the community that it's going to mostly impact. I think that's up for me. I'm gonna pass it back to Ryan to really see how this community feedback really got incorporated into the strategy that we're really proud of. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dana. That was great. Yeah, so with all of that feedback and all of this outreach we did throughout the program, we spent a lot of time figuring out what was the framework we were going to use to capture all this information that we knew, and get it into a structure that we can make sure that it's actually guiding where we're going with this plan. And this graphic is kind of just an overview of how we thought about our framework, and we thought about the measure or strategy and action development. So really at the foundation, we have those equity guardrails, which were developed with community input. So that was really the foundation of the project. And then we have kind of our key pillars of education, accessible funding and financing, and regulatory change, that we knew that each strategy was going to have actions that hit those things in order for it to be equitably implemented. And then finally, we have our kind of 4 primary strategies for furthering electrification. And these are just the places where the city can actually pull a lever or make some action or policy change that's going to increase the amount of electrification happening in the community for existing buildings. And those were time of replacement or renovation. So again, we kind of came into this thinking that we'd be able to do a lot of whole building electrification and get all these great benefits of doing that. Turns out it's a lot harder, a little bit more expensive than we anticipated. So working on this time of replacement strategy, really looking at time of replacement ordinances eventually. Time of sale. So one of the major areas that we found a really cost-effective process is at that time of sale when you can leverage mortgages and other kind of low-cost financing options to help do this. There are a handful of buildings, or a percentage of buildings in Berkeley that if you finance these electrification upgrades, you can be cash flow positive. So there's a big opportunity there, but the home buying process in Berkeley is really difficult and just high cost, a lot of jumbo loans, other hurdles there. So another strategy that hits some smaller percentage of the buildings that actually get sold. Building performance standards, which is something that we can use to hit like larger, more commercial buildings to help kind of get their efficiencies up and prioritize electrification. And then 4 is the neighborhood electrification and natural gas pruning, and kind of a longer term strategy where we may be able to, with the correct policy and regulatory changes, divert monies that would have been spent on upgrading natural gas infrastructure to then electrify like an entire spur of or neighborhood of homes within the city of Berkeley. And then we do get to leverage some of those benefits of electrifying, a whole building or a whole group of buildings, namely savings on the infrastructure side. So when we first came into this project, I think all of us were pretty excited to push this forward as quickly as possible. But after going through the modeling exercise, seeing the upfront costs, seeing the payback times, and then hearing the concerns from the community that Danae just kind of talked through, we did end up kind of moving into this more phased approach. And these dates are kind of general thoughts on when they could happen. But at the end of the day, it's not the date that's going to allow us to do this implementation. It's whether or not we're able to clear those equity guardrails. So in a lot of cases, it's, can we pass a ordinance that requires electrification on replacement? Sure, we can do that, but we need to have equitable funding and financing in place to cover the upfront costs, especially for low-income marginalized communities. Because if you have to do a hot water heater upgrade, you not only have to pay for the cost of the hot water heater, but likely if it's your first upgrade, cost of a panel upgrade potentially, new wiring potentially. So we need to make sure that there's support there. So our phasing has these timelines, but really it's whether or not there's the support in place to pass the equity guardrails. That's what's going to allow us to move on and move faster. So we kind of start on this phase 1, which is we're developing these programs. We're looking at accessible funding and finance solutions like tariff on bill financing. And once those are in place, then we can start to implement the core policy levers that are going to be like those mandatory requirements that are going to really start transitioning things quickly. And then phase 3, looking at like complete bans or turning the gas off in the city of Berkeley and getting to that complete transition away from fossil fuels. So just kind of to summarize some of the key things that we really need to work on in order to get this transition to happen a lot faster. Technologies and efficiencies. So panel upgrades are super expensive. And if you think back to the original table I had, if you take $5,000 away from a lot of those costs, you are actually looking really good. So being able to avoid that, and I saw some questions already popping up about, or comments about, opportunities to avoid panel upgrades. There's a lot of work being done there, retrofit ready products, smart meters. It's a problem that's being addressed, but we didn't really have like a solution at this point to really include here. So I think that's going to be coming along. Policy changes, obligation to serve, which is utilities kind of mandate to provide natural gas to those who want it, is going to be a hurdle. And also currently natural gas utilities are unable to allocate funds earmarked for natural gas upgrades to electrification, or what we'd call pruning. So that is going to be another kind of high level state requirement that would need to change to kind of unlock that strategy 4 of pruning, or do it in a way that is really cost effective. Equitable utility rates. Natural gas rates currently are fairly low and electricity rates are fairly high. It doesn't really capture the societal costs of natural gas to the climate, to safety, to health. So working on those. And then electricity rates are also like I said, really high. And NEM 3.0 is going to have some impacts, kind of both positive and negative, for electricity rates and for solar. So waiting to kind of see how that's going to play out, and balancing kind of some of the impacts around that is going to be really important. And then finally, accessible funding and financing, I think, is really the key here. There's a really, even in Berkeley where there's not a ton of energy use, we saw on-bill savings, which means that we can finance these things and pay them off over time. We talked a lot about tariffed on-bill financing, which is one solution of many that we are really excited about and think there's a lot of potential for. But solving that problem is going to really be the key that unlocks us being able to move faster on these things without furthering negative equity impacts to communities that are already having a really hard time just staying in Berkeley and affording to pay their rent or their utility bills. So yeah, with that, I will wrap up. Actually, I did by accident clicked on a Q&A that I would answer live about our costs. So I wanted to answer that real quick, but we did interviews with local contractors and we did costing, essentially how much, go to Home Depot, go to other stores and figure out how much these, the actual appliances cost, and then did interviews with probably 5 or 6 different installers within Berkeley, and then use that to modify existing cost analyses that have been done for like more general Northern California areas. So kind of tried to hone in and make it more specialized to Berkeley, which does have relatively high costs for installation. But yeah, with that, I'll wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. So we thought we would put out a poll just to see what aspects of this existing building electrification strategy you guys would like to hear more about. And we have some panel questions around each of these different topics. So if you could select the one that you're most interested in hearing about, then we can have a discussion around that. And just give everyone a chance to start filling out the poll. I do see a lot of questions coming in through the Q&A, so please keep those coming and they'll be queued up. We'll get to those as well. And certainly feel free to upvote the questions that you'd most like to hear answered too. And maybe Ryan, you could stop sharing your screen. We could just have the panelists. Thanks. Maybe a few more seconds to fill out the poll. Okay, should we close it out? All right, let's take a look at the results and then we can have a discussion around people's priorities. Okay, so it looks like a lot of interest in the strategies and actions for building electrification, followed by lessons learned and equity guardrails. So we'll speak to those. So let me ask the first question, and then in the meantime, please, if everyone could just keep asking questions in the Q&A. So on the strategies and actions for building electrification, what are some of the strategies that you recommended for the City of Berkeley? And what do you think would be the easiest to implement and what would be the most challenging to implement? I don't know, Katie, or Ryan, you guys want to start us off?
Yeah, maybe I can start us off, and then Katie, yeah, if you want to fill in. No, I think that with probably the easiest to implement is some sort of just permit requirements that we're no longer going to accept permits to install natural gas appliances. Probably the easiest to get going. harder to make sure that it's actually being done and we're not just driving down permit compliance. So there maybe need to be some permit compliance checks associated with that. And again, I think it's easier to implement, but we're gonna need funding and financing associated with that because it's costly. I will say Berkeley is probably one of the hardest places to do electrification. Like just all of the things that are hard are there. There's old buildings, there's really moderate climate, there's not a lot of air conditioning, again, which really improves the cost effectiveness. So yeah, it's a tough place. And I think a lot of the mandatory requirements that are really going to move things quickly are going to need those funding and financing programs in place first. But I think the time of replacement is the most cost effective, the most straightforward, and probably the thing that I think will happen the quickest.
Thanks, Ryan. And I think it's a really good question, and it's hard to answer because we have these 4 policy kind of triggers that are relevant to most cities, and so it kind of depends on where you're at and what type of political will you have in your city, and what your building stock looks like. It's going to vary kind of in ease. And so our approach is that we actually have to adjust all of them, and they all have benefits and they all have challenges in different ways. So for example, like time of replacement makes a lot of sense, but from a political standpoint, that is going to be very challenging. And from a financial standpoint, that's going to be very challenging. But we know we have to work on it. So we're going to start, moving the wheel in that direction as much as we can to try to get the supports in place. And then another area that is also very interesting and has a lot of potential, but challenging as well, as the neighborhood electrification idea of, as opposed to just electrifying a home here or there on a block, in which case the utility still has to serve gas to that entire block or that entire community, really kind of strategically decommissioning. That's really interesting for a lot of reasons, for economies of scale. And actually that's the idea that has the most interest from the labor groups and workforce development, because it can create a large amount of jobs with steady work. But we're still working, there's a lot to work through on how to actually make it work the right way. So I think there's a lot of potential, but I think as we dig in, there's going to be lots of challenges as well to work on.
Yeah, I guess I'll caveat my appliance at a time ordinance, which I think is probably the easiest to get started on with. It's probably also the worst case scenario for saving long-term dollars that we're putting into the natural gas system. So like Katie said, there's the GridWorks report that is out that kind of shows that as we electrify end uses or appliances and efficiency increases, we're going to be using less and less gas, but paying for the same amount of infrastructure. So it's kind of something we want to avoid, is that piecemeal approach. And that's something that neighborhood level electrification can really help with, is decreasing the amount of infrastructure we have in the ground that we have to pay for, and saving overall dollars. And if we're able to move that money around to help pay for the electrification work, we could be looking at like a net cost savings overall, which could be really, really great, but big hurdles to get there.
Thanks, Ryan. Katie, how did your strategy approach address rooftop solar and potential changes to NEM 3.0? I think you mentioned this a little bit, but maybe you could talk about it a bit more as part of your approach.
Yeah, so our approach was really just to know that the future is really uncertain with net energy metering. And there's a big debate as to whether getting rid of NEM is more equitable or keeping NEM is more equitable. And I think there's impacts and kind of discussions on both sides that are valid. We see really high electricity rates in part because we've been subsidizing solar, which kind of moderate to high income folks are able to get, and low income folks generally are not. So that's kind of a downside, but on the upside, there's opportunity to get solar to low income folks and get solar to multifamily buildings. And without them, it's going to make it much harder to make that pay out. So I think we didn't take a real stand on what we want to see or what should happen, but rather tried to focus our decision-making based off of that kind of bucket 2.2, which was mid-tier appliances and offset solar. So just a small amount of solar that's going to be less dependent on having a really strong NEM program, just so that we could kind of take that variable out a little bit, because it's not clear how that's going to play out.
Okay, and so now that you've sort of developed this electrification plan, what would you recommend for others to consider or plan ahead if they were to embark on something like this effort? I think maybe Katie start us off.
Sure. Yeah, and so this is something that's really important, and it was important for us from the get-go, because we knew that we're one of the first, cities to try and really look at this in depth. So we really wanted to make sure that the work that we were doing could apply as much as possible to other cities, and we could very much call out, what are things that others can do. I'd say the first thing is really the community engagement. This is something that cannot be started early enough. We as local governments have a lot of trust to rebuild for all of the historic inequities, that have happened. And so starting that and understand, even if it's understanding who are your marginalized communities, starting to have those conversations, build those relationships, understand who are the organizations that represent those communities and who are the leaders that you can start connecting with. That's all work that can happen and should happen immediately with that kind of equity focus. Another thing we did early on, as Ryan talked through, was our building inventory. This is something that we did with the Building Electrification Institute, just as a separate project to understand what our building stock looks like and how that's going to impact electrification. So that took a lot of data collecting, and I think that's an analysis that can help get the work going quicker, if that's something that you have able access to, which is challenging for us too. We also did some work on socioeconomic mapping as part of the equity work, as well as the building work, to understand the overlays of our buildings and all of the socioeconomic factors that are happening in our city, so that as we started analyzing programs and policies, we could see how that impacts different areas of the city. And, as Ryan had mentioned, that there are actually equity impacts on the payback, which was just really good information for us to know. So I think all of those things, as well as just pilot projects, I think we're proving this, and we have to be able to show that. And that will help build trust for others. So we all need to do all of that work as well. So those are some examples. I don't know if others have ideas.
Okay, well, I think we have quite a bit of questions queued up, so I can move on to that. One question was, the timing on implementation. We saw in your presentation how it's a phased approach, kind of taking into consideration funding and financing mechanisms to make sure those are in place. But are there any policies that can be implemented that still respect the equity guardrails and move the process quickly? There's one idea to sort of push for solar for all and push back against investor-owned utilities. And if there's ability for buildings to generate their own power. So did you consider this, or any ideas or approaches to this?
Yeah, I think I can kind of start off, but I think that there is this general sense like we want to be able to move fast, but there's a lot before we can do something that's mandatory and is going to have those kind of guaranteed short-term impacts. I think there's some more work we need to do, at least in Berkeley, before we can do that and feel like it's not going to disproportionately hurt a pretty big portion of the community. I think in the short term, there's a lot of opportunity to do pilots, and I think needs to be better incentives. Like in PG&E territory, like the incentives to do heat pumps are a couple $100, and in somewhere like SMUD territories, a few $1,000s, and that can make a huge difference. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to get done as far as getting better electrification programs in place from PG&E or community choice aggregators. Education is huge. I saw there's another question in here about, does a time of replacement ordinance even help that much? Because once your hot water heater is burned out, like, do you want to go through this whole process to figure out how to get a heat pump? And no, like that sucks. But I think if we get the education done, both to building owners to say, hey, this stuff is coming, you should start prepping for it, and you give the incentives and you educate the installers that there's opportunities here, then I think you can start seeing some change without having those mandatory measures. But at the end of the day, like, we're talking about equity as far as not negatively impacting disadvantaged communities, but we're also expecting to see increases in natural gas costs. So not doing anything for those communities is also super inequitable, because it's saddling them with poor air quality, saddling them with less resilience, saddling them with higher costs in the future. So we kind of go back to this idea that like the status quo is not like today or a change. It's like things are changing and things are going to get more expensive. So we need to act either way. It's just that balance between how much and when and which things need to be in place before we can get there. So a little bit of a roundabout answer, but I don't know that there is just like one thing we can do today that's like, this is going to get us everything we want super fast. I think there's a lot of things we have to do today, which sucks, right? That's a bummer of an answer. I wish I could say like, do this one thing and it'll be great, but it's a lot of things, and it's a lot of communication and a lot of working with your community to figure out the things they need. And I think that thing is primarily going to be funding and financing to get this work done in an equitable manner.
Can I add on to that?
Yeah, go for it.
I think really to move at the speed that we need to move as the city is doing those things like constituent outreach and education, workforce development, all those things that Ryan's talking about. Really the biggest priority is just pounding the table for the state and regulators to enable some of these changes that are outside the city's control, which may be a little bit of a cop-out, but things like tariffed on-bill financing, utility capital and expense accounting reform, maybe getting some Biden money through a Green New Deal and establishing funding programs like that breaks this wide open, and it's a completely different story. So I think to some degree that really is the biggest priority here. And then responding to the idea of solar for all, I just want to call out that this is a really interesting topic that I think we all on the team learned a lot about. It's tricky from a policymaking perspective because under at least current NEM rules, any solar PV owner who's a net exporter onto the grid is increasing the cost of electricity for everyone else who doesn't have solar. It's great if everyone has solar, but we're a long ways off from that, right? So the next best solution is really just making sure that homeowners have enough solar to match their loads and don't really export much, if at all, to the grid. But how do you make sure as a policymaker that that's actually what happens? I don't think we have a clear answer for that, but it's a challenging balance between solar and electrification.
And can you speak a bit to any findings you had about where in the city the electrification would work best, or which types of buildings electrification would really pencil out the best?
Yeah, I think that one's for me. I think the most interesting thing to call out here is that the economics of electrification don't work as well for multifamily homes. At least that's what we saw in our modeling. And multi-family homes are disproportionately occupied by underserved communities, right? So we saw in our batch modeling approach, if you compared the modeling results against census district data, there was a really clear correlation between the cost of electrification and the diversity of your neighborhood, or the median income level in your neighborhood. Electrification is more cost effective for richer, wider areas in Berkeley. That's tough. That's something that we need. You can't have a one size fits all approach to this. And I think it also really reveals kind of a compelling truth for other modeling efforts. If there are other modelers on the line working with other cities today, you really need to put the same sort of effort into quantifying the equity impacts of the solutions you're proposing that you would put into quantifying the energy, carbon, or cost impacts, because there are some really significant implications that we need to deal with through policy.
I think there's, oh, sorry, Rima, taking your moderator role. There's a question that I think fits in good with this or fits in well, that Michael, to elaborate on the state and federal legislation that you think kind of specifically would help build this out. And, I know you mentioned tariff on bill financing, but that is just such, for me, like as we went through this process, that was just like the thing that seemed to solve the most problems is if we could have, I mean, we have $1 billion a year fund for climate action funded by cap and trade that's replenished every year. Like we need a big pot of money to pay for the upfront cost of electrification that we could then pay back over time with the savings from electrification. And that is one of the things that I think could work is like a higher, like it's hard for the city to put a program like that in place or maybe even utility, but the state could put money aside to do something like that, which I think would be really interesting. But I know there's some others you probably want to touch on.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting ones. And I'll just say, I've gotten some feedback even from others at RMI, full disclosure, that I should not be putting all my eggs in one basket when it comes to tariff on-bill financing. But personally, it just feels like this work is hard enough already that you kind of need something like tariff on-bill financing, something that is accessible to renters and residents with low credit scores, something that can be combined with other funding sources when that money is made available, and something that you don't need a third party for because that's tough to get uptake on, right? And I understand that some people have been fighting for tariff on-bill financing for years or decades even. It may not be the only solution, but it does kind of check all of those boxes. And it's worth noting that at least elsewhere, there has been some movement on tariff on-bill financing. I do a lot of work in Colorado, and I know Xcel Energy here recently identified tariff on-bill financing as a priority in some of their recent DSM proceedings over more traditional options like on-bill repayment. So the tide is shifting when it comes to tariff on-bill financing, and I completely agree. It really breaks this open. The other really obvious, I guess, bucket of policies that comes to mind is around this utility capital and expense accounting reform. There's this great idea, GridWorks paper, most notably, that was released a couple of years ago, and I've done a lot of work on this topic on gas pruning and decommissioning, and the idea that combined utilities should be able to put some money towards electrification just by saving money on their on decommissioning their least profitable or most maintenance-heavy gas lines. But there isn't currently a good way for utilities to actually move money from point A to point B in that strategy. And there isn't even a great way for utilities to figure out when it's time for a gas decommissioning project. So they don't know how to identify the opportunity until it's too late. And even if they did, they don't know how to take advantage of the money that is presented and move that money from one bucket to the other. That's something that really, really needs to change. And I'm sure there are several more in the report, but those are the two that are top of mind for me.
Okay, thank you. Let's shift a bit to the education, the engagement and outreach approach. Was there any education done around the concepts of energy efficiency and electrification? And if so, how did you approach that messaging? This is for Danae.
Yeah, I think we engaged around all relevant topics on this strategy and more so listened. A lot of our engagement was around listening to what communities already knew, what was a priority for them. A piece of it was explaining what the strategy was setting out to do, but more than anything, we needed to know there was already somewhat of a plan, but we needed to know what the specific impacts of the community were. And I feel like speaking to energy efficiency and electrification, the feedback we got was more so related to the impacts of some of those specific topic areas of what might have been more important than folks that were concerned around energy efficiency. We heard a lot about like building community resilience or tenant protections versus, them specifically concerned with electrification. And of course, Ryan, Katie, feel free to hop in on that as well.
Oh, one of the cool things was at a lot of the workshops, we had someone from the community give like a rundown. Like we had people from those communities who kind of knew what was up, and they were able to give a description of like, what is electrification, or like, how is this going to impact you from their perspective, and including things that just like me giving a rundown of, how I think about electrification would have totally missed. And I thought that was really cool and beneficial. And it's probably not always going to be the case. I think Berkeley does have a lot of like really like into environmental and environmental justice and into these areas, but finding some folks in those communities to give that discussion, or even a train the trainer type thing, is like a really cool way to do it and get the right words there.
Yeah, that just reminded me of something that's really important. I specifically remember making sure that in tailoring our engagement strategy and approaches, not going into it thinking that all communities needed education, and making sure we were very sensitive to that. And especially when you talk about BIPOC communities, folks think that we need to bring in education. They don't know about this. We need to educate them about this. And a lot of the education was already there. A lot of these communities already knew about electrification. There were some misconceptions that maybe needed clarity. There were specific concerns about what they already knew. Some were already working in the industry and in the field. And again, as Ryan said, so we were able to utilize and hear about what education they had already been providing in this community, how we could leverage that or provide clarity around the specific strategy. So I think those, thanks for the reminder, Ryan, that was something else important around this topic.
Yeah, that's all. It was such great. It was such a great approach, Danae, that you took with all of the meetings that you held and the forums and things. And I'd say one other thing I feel like that I learned was that, and it makes sense, it's not a surprise, but I think something that kind of rang very loud and clear during those meetings was by asking people what their priorities were and understanding that it's the health, it's the resilience, it's the comfort, it's the fact that these are the people that are dealing with more asthma and poor air quality every day, not just on smoke days, trying to understand that and hear that and be able to reinforce the health benefits, for example, of electrification. And, as we identify programs and policies, wanting to make sure that we can incorporate those other health, safety, comfort benefits that people want, like the things that people want. A lot of folks were saying, I have mold in my apartment. Like, I don't know about a fancy induction cooktop, but can you fix the mold in my apartment, or, things like that. So how can we, as in local government, try to layer all these benefits together and give people what they really want, in addition to electrification, which has a lot of benefits. So just trying to take that kind of holistic approach.
Yeah, I think talking about like the mold in your apartment like that, there was a question about like, why does the energy efficiency not pay back? And it's like, on a dollars and cents basis, Berkeley doesn't heat and cool enough to make it pay back, as far as the model says. But we have these situations where homes are they're not healthy enough and safe enough, and they need upgrades. And there are some like really great possible benefits to do like a more holistic building approach in those areas. It does increase the cost, and we need to value that in some other way other than just like how much it costs, it adds to your energy bill or saves you. So I think that's like taking that more holistic approach is still really important.
So with the community engagement approach, what did you hear from the community that you were surprised about, but that made its sort of way into the equity guardrails or the strategies? And then and then this part is probably more towards Katie, how would you say that your experience working with Ecology Center might help shape your approach to future projects or even implementation of this project in terms of engaging with the community? So maybe you start off with Danae or Ryan and Michael, what you heard from the community that was a little surprising and how it made its way into the strategy.
I was going to unmute because everything I heard was great feedback, but I'm kind of handing this over. So maybe Ryan, Michael, you can speak to maybe what was surprising having already.
Yeah, I think going in, like the cost thing seemed obvious to me, like this is going to cost money, and it's hard for folks without a lot of money or to pay extra money. Like that just it makes sense. I think the most surprising thing that I heard was concern over any type of building upgrade, because folks were living in kind of illegal housing. So there's like throughout the city, there's places where people are like in extra rooms and in extra, in a converted garage that hasn't been permitted. And they're super concerned that any type of upgrade to that building would, bring essentially their displacement. And that's something that like I had not thought about at all. And yeah, it's just, there's a bunch of other items as well where it's just like, yeah, like it makes sense once you get into it, but if you aren't living that experience, it's really hard to outline those all ahead of time. And so yeah, getting that feedback and having those equity guardrails set up while we were doing the actions to be like, will this actually work, was a big deal.
And then I can jump on your second question around how will this work impact our future work. And I'm so proud of the work that this team did, and I really want to give so much credit to the team who came in from the get-go understanding that the city wanted to put equity first. We put this in the RFP, which I think is also an important step that other folks should follow, saying that we wanted to lead with equity. But this is the team that came in giving an equal amount of budget to the equity work. And so that's just something I'm super proud of, and I'm proud of the work that we've done. But now is the hard work to your question, where we have to really stay committed to following the equity guardrails and implementation. So we're just starting now. And I think the work that we've done has really shifted the way that at least we in our office want to do our work on an ongoing basis. But we also recognize that we've just started this process of building trust. We still have so much more trust to build. And the city is big. We are one division within a department of multiple departments of a city. So there's so much happening. So that trust has to be built on lots of different levels, and coordination has to be better, so that we can work better together for the community. And so I think we really have to, stay committed to that and make sure that we're doing it. But we haven't done it yet. We have to start that work now.
Okay, makes sense. And I have one last question, and then I think we can close out. So there's a question that came in asking about if the tenants are paying the utility bills in a multifamily building, how do you get the building owner to look towards electrification?
Tariff on bill financing is one solution.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any final thoughts by the panelists before we bring back that slide deck and close out? And thanks everyone for contributing your thoughts. There's been a lot of good discussion in the chat. I encourage everyone to look at that, as well as all the questions that got queued up. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Rima, and to our panel for that really insightful conversation. And thanks to our audience for making it engaging and asking questions and chatting in the chat box. I do want to give one more shout out to our sponsors. And on the next slide, we'll go over some of our upcoming events for the week. We do have 2 more tomorrow. We have a couple more on Thursday as well. So please do join us. And then lastly, if you haven't already seen the link in the chat, we'll send it again, but we do have a post-session survey that we would love to get your feedback for this session, to hear about what you thought. And by answering this survey, which by the way, there's no limit to how many times you can have the option to be entered into a raffle for a $50 gift card. So please do share your feedback. We love to hear it. And just as a quick reminder, all of the slides, recordings, all that good stuff for every session will be posted to the website after the forum closes on August 19th. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.